Hi there, my name is Ian Gotts. Welcome to this Trailhead Live session on business process mapping. So I've been around the Salesforce ecosystem since about 2000, but actually I need to take my history back a lot further. The first time I came across business process mapping was 1986. I was the junior consultant on a project with a big aerospace company for Accenture, and I was given a bit of architecture mapping software called AutoCAD, and I was told to map out the whole operation for an ERP, an enterprise resource planning system. And that's where I started my business process mapping. And since that project, I then went on and ran a company called Nimbus Partners, which was a process mapping solution aimed at highly regulated Fortune 500 companies, which then rolls us forward to Elements. And again, a business process mapping solution alongside some other things that we do. So what I want to do is talk about some principles that have been driven business benefits in organizations ranging from the very largest multinational companies right down to innovative startups. So some techniques which you can apply very easily to your projects, which will give you a ton of benefits. So first of all, we want to think about how business process mapping fits within the context of the implementation lifecycle around Salesforce. So it's really in the analyze phase here when we're talking about capturing and understanding what the business processes are that we need to go and implement in Salesforce. And we should be clear about what those requirements are before we start build. And for any of you who've seen any of my earlier presentations about requirements capture, about adoption, you'll know that this point about making sure you're very clear about exactly what the users need, not what they think they want, but what they genuinely need. You need to bottom that out before you start building. And obviously we go around the build, deliver, on operate cycle, coming back with new requirements, which then feed back into mapping the processes. So the other point about the process maps is that they're not a one-off activity. They are part of this implementation life cycle. And it says up there on the left-hand side, we need to drive around this cycle so we make sure we get good adoption. And that's all about making sure we understand what the business wants. But also the adoption means that they understand how to use the applications they've built. And you'll see how the process maps fit in that. The second thing is agility. We need to be able to drive around this cycle quickly. And that means that we need end users to understand how the business has changed so that they can adopt those new changes. And finally, we need to do it with trust. We need to make sure that as we drive around this cycle, that we have confidence we're not going to break the business, we're not going to break the Salesforce implementation. So let's just think about where business processes fit within the analysis part of that life cycle. Up here, we have requirements that come in from end users. It could be through feedback, a statement of work, could be some suggestions, some random wishes, and maybe there are a few gems there. So with those requirements, we need to validate the requirements and make sure that, first of all, the requirements that are coming in are the ones that genuinely are the business need. And secondly, that we need to identify new requirements that maybe the end users haven't thought of. And the way we do that is by mapping processes. And then once we've mapped those processes, we're then in a position to then build out those user stories, analyze the impact on the org, and therefore give the user stories across to the development team with both the story, but also the context of the business process and an impact analysis. And only then do the developers have something to build where they have the confidence they're building the right thing. And by build, that could be configure, as in declarative, or it could be coding in terms of building applications. It doesn't matter. It still gets driven off a really clear understanding about the business requirements in the context of how the business operation works. The other thing about mapping processes and understanding the process, it's a great way of saying no to end users. And what I mean by that is a user comes to you and says, I really, really need this feature. And if you're relatively junior, it's quite hard to say no. So the best thing is you look at the business process and say to the end user, tell me how we're going to change this business process based on your needs. And one of three answers will come out. One is, as you go through that business process, the end user will go, oh, hang on, the application you've built already does that. This is how the business works. So you've already satisfied the requirement without making any changes whatsoever. The second situation you get is that the end user goes, I really want this feature. And they realize once they understand the business process that the feature they wanted was not actually what they wanted. and then you can work out what they really need. And the third situation is that maybe they actually genuinely do know what they want, and it is a change to the business process. But all three of those situations, you're engaging the end users, and therefore, no matter how senior they are, you can have a conversation about what really needs to be built. The worst thing in the world is to be a just admin, where someone comes to your desk, says they want something, and you just build it. Because over time, you're building the wrong things. Adoption goes south. You get very poor adoption, or the other issue you end up is you're building the wrong things. So let's think about how you would map those business processes. So there are many different formats and styles. There's process mapping, BPMN, which is business process mapping notation, UML, architecture diagrams, value stream maps, flowcharts, SIPOC, and customer journey maps. So it's quite challenging out there to work out what's the best way of doing this. So to understand what style of business process mapping that we need to use, we need to think about the audience. Now, you wouldn't start writing a book unless you had a clear view about the audience. So therefore, the four audiences that I think about from a business process perspective are, number one, end users. So clearly, first of all, the end users are the people engaged and the process maps are the way to help us understand what they need. But those process maps are also valuable to the end users as training content. When they're trying to navigate the application or applications, understanding how the process flow works and having those process maps with links to training content means they can use those process maps to help them understand and navigate the way through the applications. Second audience is the developers. They have user stories that are delivered to them so they can build them either in code or declaratively. But having the business processes as context helps them understand why an application needs to be built in a certain way. The less ambiguity there is between the requirements that are written and what gets built, the better chance of them building the correct application and therefore driving up end user adoption. The third audience is management. They don't necessarily think about process, they think about metrics. But the processes help them understand what the right metrics are to be measured to drive the right behavior. We've all heard the term, you act as you're measured. So provided we are identifying the metrics which support those business processes, then the metrics will drive and reinforce the behavior, and it will encourage people to follow due process. And that's really important for the fourth audience, the auditors. If you are in a highly regulated industry like food, pharma, oil and gas, financial services, then being able to demonstrate that the teams are following the processes that are written out is really important in terms of compliance. So again, those processes being delivered to the end users, which are version controlled, gives the auditors confidence that you're following due process. And it also means that you're only creating one bit of content, and all four of these people, different audiences, can all use that same content. You're not creating different content for different audiences, which is massively wasteful. So when we think about those audiences and the different styles of mapping, several of these are most relevant. Business process mapping, flowcharts, SIPOC, and customer journey maps. They all describe the operation from a business perspective rather than a very technical perspective like BPMN or UML. And there's a standard around called UPN, Universal Process Notation. This standard is not tied to a particular product, a particular mapping tool. It's a universal notation. There are many different tools you can use to draw the notation. But what it does is it actually approaches process mapping, thinking about those audiences. Now, UPN wasn't designed for Salesforce implementations. It was designed for business process mapping and actually driving business improvements, driving business agility. Obviously, Salesforce is a supporting application that helps the business run better. But I want to go through just a few examples of the business benefits you get, irrespective of what systems are sitting behind the scenes. The business benefits from business process mapping, and particularly these examples are UPN. Now, I need to be clear, these are not customers of elements.cloud. These are benefits that we've seen in previous operations I've worked in. So the first in Nestle, senior guy in Nestle head of continuous excellence, said end-to-end process thinking is to break functional silos. It's absolutely critical to our company to deliver our Nestlé model. A guy here in the manufacturing industry, the speed of access to processes and local procedures was increased by 34 times. So that's about process being a valuable training resource. And I happen to know that this example was the 34 times is accurate because they did a study of with and without access to those process maps. Here, an example in the oil and gas industry. A process model helps us articulate and pinpoint shortcomings in ways that are simply not possible when relying on language alone. So again, that idea that business process maps are a very good way of having a consistent language. Here, an example from the banking industry. The cost per transaction is reduced from 16 euros to 3 euros. We've exceeded our target for automatic processing. So again, the ability to use process maps to drive and streamline business processes with some hard numbers there in terms of the benefits. Carphone Warehouse, which is part of Best Buy. The primary success criteria for how to, and that's the name they gave to the content, which was their process maps, is mass adoption. Put simply, it's about helping the right people do the right things at the right time. So again, great example there about why those business processes delivered to their stores, I think 800 stores, is driving some business benefits. Here's a different example from obviously an investment bank. If we'd had our processes up to date when we started the restructure, we could have executed in half the time that we did. So again, massive benefits there in terms of understanding how the business operates. And finally, Twinings, the tea company. It's a way of creating a step change in our ways of working as we look for new and innovative ways of staying ahead. And whilst this is a quote from a number of years ago, it couldn't be more valid today. With the time of COVID, where we're all looking at digital transformation and we're not clear about exactly what the future holds, and therefore we're constantly iterating to work out how to stay ahead, business processes are a key part of that. And as you say, that quote really underlines the importance of business process mapping. So let's have a look at the business process mapping UPN notation. So some very simple principles here. First of all, when we think about the audience who are now looking at this online, maybe in a web browser or embedded inside a Salesforce screen, we need to keep the diagrams fairly small. So 8 to 10 boxes on a screen. Secondly, you can see that the boxes all start with a verb: request, resolve, test, analyze, fix. So again, start every activity box with a verb. The other thing you'll see that is that there are no diamonds. People ask me, well, where are the diamonds? Where are the decisions? Well, if I look at box 4 there, resolve technical support request in the center, that has 2 outputs, one resolve, one new issue. So implied in that box is the decision. So instead of adding more boxes to make decisions, the decision is contained within the box. And then that's, again, another key point because it starts to keep the diagrams tighter and smaller. The other thing is you'll see the diagrams flow left to right, which is the way that the eye naturally flows. So starts with unhappy customer requesting support, flows all the way to the right to confirm with customer, and then a happy customer is the output. And the reason you can make those diagrams relatively easy is because instead of creating swim lanes where we're trying to place the boxes somewhere on a swim lane and therefore the diagrams become quite unwieldy, instead we have this idea of a resource that sits along the bottom. And you can have one or many resources in technical support, customer, you could have systems along the bottom as a resource. So those mechanisms I've talked about are all about making the diagram tighter, easier to read. I always say the confused mind says no. If you give me a diagram with 50 boxes on it, I'll glaze over. With 8 or 10 boxes, I can understand it, go, okay, I kind of get this. You'll notice that some of the boxes have a corner that is filled out. That means there's a lower level diagram. So the principle of UPN is a hierarchy. So any box can drill down to the next level of detail. So instead of having big complex diagrams, I can simplify it. So let's pick box 7 at the bottom there, the purple one, test issue. At the moment, I've got coming in new issue, cannot produce the issue, going back to the customer, or to the right, reproduce issue. How do I test the issue? Well, I can see there, I can drill down and there'll be a diagram below that which describes how to test the issue. You can also see there are paper clips. So that idea of a paperclip is any box should have supporting information, which means that if I want to understand how to test the issue, maybe there's a procedure, maybe there's a video, maybe there's a link to a system, I can go straight from this activity box straight to that application. And finally, probably the most important thing about these diagrams is the lines between the boxes. Those handoffs between the boxes are probably the most important part of the diagram. It tells me when I've finished. When I say between box 2 and box 3, resolved, what does that mean? Does resolved support request mean that the customer is happy and implemented it? Does it mean that I've understood what the request is and it's now in the backlog? Does it mean the backlog's in the software, but the customer hasn't yet tested it? So a lot of the discussions when you're building these process maps in live workshops is getting clarity on what the handoffs are. When I see process diagrams without lines or without boxes, you might as well throw them away. They're not process diagrams. They are a first start to a process diagram. They're useless. You need process diagrams which have inputs, text on the lines, verbs on the boxes, lines coming out of the boxes, and then the last line finishes with an outcome. So they are the principles of UPN. Very easy to understand. You don't need to worry about lots of different notations, different shapes, what different things mean, which means it's very easy for end users to understand this without any training. Again, critically important because we're delivering these activity boxes to end users as training. We're expecting end users to sit in live workshops when we're starting to understand processes. We don't want to spend the first half an hour of an hour workshop explaining what the different shapes mean. And as you saw from all those examples of the business benefits, this works. It works for massively complex multinationals where the process map may be 1,000 diagrams. And whilst that may sound daunting, you're not looking at 1,000 diagrams. You're simply looking at one diagram and then going, I need more detail, I'll drill down, I'll drill down. It works equally well for innovative startups. Elements ourselves, we use this notation, obviously, and our entire business is mapped in terms of their business processes. And I read an article in Forbes magazine today that said they got a bunch of experts together, and what are the top 14 things from the 14 experts they recommend to make sure that you engage people, particularly when we're all working remotely. Number 6 was, you need your processes documented. You need everybody on the same page. So now is the time to understand how to get this process mapping done. Now, it's not difficult to do, and we'll have a little bit of a play in terms of showing you how to map processes. But this is something that every one of us can do. I wouldn't recommend that the first time you start mapping processes is in a live workshop with 10 of the most important stakeholders. This is something you should do. Think of maybe a situation outside your work life you need to map out. You can do it quietly on your own. So let's have a look at this in practice. So here we are in Salesforce. Actually, we're in work.com, and I wanted to use this as a good example. And if we say we want to go and look at, say, employees, and we go and pick out any employee, doesn't really matter. There's an employee record inside Salesforce. And you can see we have embedded a process diagram inside the Salesforce screen. So if I want to understand how, in this case, to send a wellness survey, I have the process maps with all the instructions on how to send a survey. I can zoom in and out. And there you can see how the process map works very well as end user training. I could also obviously link it to an object. And there I can see, again, a process map inside Salesforce. So this is, you can see it in a training context, and this obviously has to be the signed off version of the diagram. So let's go into elements. Let's go and have a look at that diagram. So again, you can see the diagram here. I'm now inside elements. But what I want to talk about is the principles of how you map processes. So one of the things that's important is having some idea of version control. So you can see this is version 9. Obviously, I can't edit the signed off version because that's the one the end user is looking at. But if I go into the draft version, then this is the work in progress, the one that I can work on. And obviously then I can go into edit mode. So you can start to see here, we've got this idea of inputs, activities, outputs, and then at the end of here, this clearly goes somewhere. If I click on that, it will take me to wherever the next step is. And you can start to see the process diagram that's connected. So again, one of the important things when you're building out this hierarchy is to make sure that you have some connections between the diagrams so people don't get lost. There's no point sending someone to a folder with 50 diagrams and no idea how they're all connected. This clearly is, this is box 1.23, which means that there must be a high level diagram above it. If I roll over there, I can see there's the top level picture for how all the diagrams fit together. So let's pick any one of these and see how we can, say, drill down and start mapping processes and just thinking about how to do that. So this is an issue that we've sent the survey, but it's not been completed within 3 days. We need to resend it. So how would I resend it? So maybe I could link to a supporting note or a URL or how to do it. But what I want to go and do is actually draw the process map below. So we just click on new. And now I have an input and an output. It said the input says not completed within 3 days, and how do we resend it? So now I need to double click. Maybe there are 2 or 3 steps to go there. So what's the first thing we need to do is we need to check whether received. And maybe if it was received, we would do one thing. If for some reason it wasn't received, draw a line there. So if it's not received, we probably need to check email address. There's no point resending it if the email wasn't received. And who would do that? Well, this is where we could add a resource. And maybe we say that this is HR. The HR admin goes and checks the resource, and probably also the admin also checks whether it's been received. So if it has been received, maybe we resend. Well, we need to think about how we do that. So we don't need that one. Just move this line here. And the output of that is new email. So this says check email. So maybe this is check, should be actually not check, but update email. So you can start to see the act there of me mapping the process makes me think about that output, new email, maybe change what I think that process activity was. So you can start to see how the simple act of mapping from an input to an output and making sure we have the lines, making sure we have the resources, makes us think more clearly about what happens for each of these different activities. Now, resend's not good enough. Resend wellness, check. And I could now right mouse click and maybe add a link to a note which explains how we do that. Or maybe there's a video, right mouse click, link to a URL with the video. Maybe there's a screenshot that I could post. So again, we're trying to think about how we add supporting information so this is valuable when it's in the hands of an end user, in this case, the HR admin, going, how do I do that? How do I update the email address? So maybe that is a link to the particular Salesforce screen where I update the location. So maybe it's that URL there. New URL. This is employee layout. Now we've got that attachment. So very simple in terms of this process. It's not difficult to do. One of the things we found is this works really well in live workshops and really helps engage end users. So you can see now we've mapped that out. There's now a lower level diagram attached to that because that's what we did, we drill down. So you can start at the top and just keep on drilling down and drilling down and drilling down. And then obviously I now need to publish this, so then the most up-to-date version is the one that we would see that the end users would look at. So there's plenty of training content out there about how to map processes. There'll be some links at the end. There's some short videos as well about how to use this. Elements is in terms of its simple process mapping, it's a completely free product. Obviously, the more sophisticated part of it with all the version control and links to Salesforce is a paid product. But in terms of simply doing the process mapping, you can get going right away with the free product. So before we leave this diagram, let's highlight some of the aspects of UPN, which make it such a powerful modeling notation for you as Salesforce admins, developers, or consultants. First of all, no more than 8 or 10 boxes on a screen, so we keep it fairly tight, fairly simple, reading left to right to make it easy for those people who've had no training whatsoever to understand how the diagram works. Secondly, every activity starting with a verb: create, send, complete, update. Next, lines between the boxes and text on all the lines. Then we have resources, so we know who's responsible or which systems are responsible for doing particular activities. We have the concept of drill downs, so if we want to go into more detail, we can drill down to a lower level of detail. We have attachments, so we can attach documents, we can even attach links to Salesforce metadata items. So we're starting to document how we've configured our Salesforce system, or we understand if we change this process, what items in Salesforce need to be changed. And finally, we have version control. So we can see how this diagram has changed over time, and we have a signed off version, which is what our end users are looking at. So what are the key takeaways? First of all, there are massive business benefits in mapping processes. It's not just a precursor to your Salesforce implementation. The act of mapping processes will drive out business benefits that you didn't expect in terms of simplifying and streamlining your business operations, and you'll get business benefits there. The second, it feels like process mapping takes time, but you will accelerate the implementation. Those business process maps will help you understand your requirements. It will really solidify what the end users want, which means there will be less rework in development. So whilst it feels like it takes time, you must hold firm and make sure you do this piece of work before you start build, and you will see the acceleration through the development cycle and into adoption. And the third point is that this content is the basis of continuous business improvement. It's not something you use to create the business requirements and then throw away. This is valuable content that you build on over time, hence the importance of this version control. So think of this content as almost the operations manual that's building over time. So it's a valuable resource that sits alongside Salesforce and your other systems. So a couple of resources, drawing process maps, there's some free approaches. Clearly there's elements.cloud. I'm obviously slightly biased. But there's you can use that for free. There are products like draw.io, and obviously there's pen and paper. Quite often, if I'm thinking about process, I may start with a whiteboard or pen and paper. So you don't have to be using systems to start with. Obviously, it's slightly more difficult using pen and paper and then getting embedded inside Salesforce. I guess you could use a screenshot of your pen and paper. But again, think about these process maps as a valuable resource. So therefore, at some point, it needs to be in a system that everyone can access. There's some training there. We built some training content on how to map processes, but also how to think about processes in the context of the continuous improvement, that implementation lifecycle. If you've got any comments or questions, please reach out to me. My email details are there, or hit me up on Twitter. Again, thank you so much for joining me for this session. And please go out there, start thinking about how business process mapping can help you accelerate your business operations, accelerate your Salesforce implementations. Once you get this skill, you'll find it will be invaluable in terms of also accelerating your career. So thank you.